Well, good evening, everyone. I'm so honored to be here to be able to share with you something of my mother's art and story. Some of you may have seen the exhibit already, either at this time. Some of you may have seen it in other museums. This is, I think, the third or maybe the fourth time that the artwork has been at AVAM. And it is deeply meaningful for us to have it there now. And in this most beautiful installation of all. So I wanted to share with you something of my mother's art and her story, and tell you a little bit about some of the pieces. These are not all of the pieces that I'm going to go through, but sort of a sampling, let's say. So if we can go to the next, well, actually, let's just stay here for the moment, and then we'll go to the first slide. So let me just tell you a little bit about my mother. My mother was born in a little tiny village in the center of Poland called Nishik, and she was 12 years old in 1939 when the Germans invaded Poland and they came straight to her village. And 3 years later, after occupying it, the Germans ordered everyone in her village and the surrounding area to report to a nearby train station. And they told them that anyone who is found in their house after 10 o'clock in the morning would be shot. My mother refused to go. So she took her 13-year-old sister, she was 15, and the two of them said goodbye to their family, and they never saw them again. All my life, I heard these stories, my mother's stories of her survival, unlike perhaps most other Holocaust survivors who couldn't talk about their experiences. My mother could not keep from talking about her experiences. But when she was about 50, my mother decided that she wanted my sister and me to see what her home and her family looked like. So she had never been trained as an artist. She didn't know how to draw, but she could sew anything. So she took a large piece of fabric, she sketched in her house and her family, and she made the very first picture. So if we can move to that slide, Jasmine. This was the very first picture that she made. And in it, she has, you can see at the bottom of the picture on the left, she's walking up the hill to her house from the river, carrying a couple of buckets of water. Her sister, Manya, is waiting for her. Her father is standing next to the house with her younger sister, Hannah. Her mother is sitting there with the youngest child, Leah, her sister. And then her brother is standing there with a horse and wagon. And she would say that this was, at that time, they were all very happy there. So when she was finished, she was very pleased with it, and she gave this picture to me, as the older daughter. And in next slide, please. She made a companion piece for my sister. And this is the view from the other side of the road. And here, Esther depicted herself with her brother Reuben swimming in the river. And her sisters are standing on the sides of the river, and the ducks and the geese and the cows are all by the riverbanks as well. And you can see the farmers coming in from the fields with her house again in the background. And then she gave this one for my sister, and she set these memory pictures aside for about 10 years. My kids were born then, and she was very busy making toys and clothes and pictures for them. And my mother at the same time had a women's clothing store, so she was busy running a business as well. But then about 10 years later, she went back to these memory pictures, and this time she started adding stitched captions. She started telling her story. So if we go to the next slide, I want to point out to you that I'm going to show you these pictures in chronological order, but my mother didn't create them in chronological order. I refer to this as the psychological order with which she created these pictures as they came to her. And I'll show you as we get to that point which ones, and you may notice from the style and workmanship, you may notice which ones were the earlier pictures and which later. But the first few pictures that are exhibited are pictures that occurred, or memories from before the war. And most of them were of the Jewish holidays, which were very precious to her in her memory. This picture was of a Jewish holiday called Shavuos or Shavuot. This is dated 1938 in June. This holiday usually occurs. And here, her brother, who was the oldest in the family, my mother was the oldest girl, her brother had made a pair of stilts. And my mother used to say that her brother was the toy maker and she was the toy tester, because she was something of a tomboy. And so here she's trying out the stilts on their way to their grandparents' house. And here her brother and her three sisters are walking behind her, and she's leading the way. And one of the things that I really loved about this picture was the way in which she remembered herself as standing head and shoulders above her siblings and leading the way. But also, I love this picture because of its incredible beauty. Its colors are so alive, and the embroidery is so exuberant. She loved this wheat motif. They're walking through a field of wheat, and she loved it so much that she continued the motif around the border. This is the only picture in which she's used embroidery in the border itself. And I did want to point out that here, the color, the blue of the border, which matches the blue of the cornflowers in the fields. My mother did most of her pictures with black borders. All the pictures that took place during the war years were bordered in black. But when she wanted to do the pictures from before the war and after the war, she wanted to change the color. So here she used this incredibly beautiful blue. Jasmine, next slide, please. And here you can see up close the braids standing against her dress, and the beautiful detail of the wheat. Next slide, please. Now the war arrives. This is now September 1939. Immediately after the war started, my mother had heard that there was a unit of German soldiers that had entered her village, and her grandparents' house was at the entrance to the village. So she and a couple of her friends, who were standing in the foreground there on the bottom, went to her grandparents' house to watch the soldiers come in. And while she was watching, one of the soldiers dismounted and pulled her grandfather off the steps of his house to cut off his beard. Next slide, Jasmine. You can see the detail here. Only Jewish men wore beards. So when the soldier saw Esther's grandfather, he knew that he was a Jew. And this was how he showed his disrespect for a Jewish man. And this was the way the war began for my mother. Next slide, please. The next, this picture is from June or July rather of 1940. My mother was then 13. And as I said, the Germans were occupying her village. And my mother one day developed this terrible toothache. She had heard that there was a dentist in the German camp, but she wouldn't go to him as herself. She felt she needed to pretend to be a Polish girl because she didn't think that the dentist would help her if he knew she was Jewish. So she got one of her Polish friends to go with her, and she taught her to say in German, "My sister has a toothache." So here my mother is being treated by the dentist, and he's pulling out her tooth. And after he finished, he gave her a piece of chocolate, which presumably was because she was such a good patient. And then she went home to tell her mother what she had done. She did not ask her mother or tell her mother what she was intending to do beforehand, because she knew her mother would forbid her to do it. And when she told her mother was shocked that she had had the nerve to do this, to walk into the German camp. But my mother was in pain and she was desperate, and her pain drove her to it. And of course, this was a kind of foreshadowing of what my mother was later to do to save her life. And she was, by the way, when my mother would tell this story, my mother was also shocked that she had had the nerve to do this. Next slide, please. This is now June of 1941. So by this point in the occupation, the Jews were no longer allowed to own livestock, which was a real hardship for her family. Her father was a horse trader. He used to travel around buying and selling horses. And her mother raised poultry to take to the market to sell. So their livelihoods were cut off. And so my mother, who was at this point 14, and her sister, and Manya, who was 12, they went to work for neighboring farmers, Polish farmers. And so here, it was a beautiful day in June, and my mother and Manya took the cows that they were tending to the good pasture, as she thought of it, down by the Vistula River. And when they got there, my mother could see through the trees that they were next to this slave labor camp, Yanishev. Before the war, it had been a prison camp for Poles who would be taken there to rebuild this earthen dam, which would get flooded and need to be rebuilt every spring. And as my mother and Manya were in this pasture, they could see through the trees that the camp had become a place for young Jewish boys and men to be taken to rebuild the dam. And while they were looking, they could see a boy who was taken into the woods, presumably because he was too exhausted to work anymore, and there he was shot. And my mother could hear the shots ring out again and again. And after they saw all this, then they left and went back home. So in this picture, as I said before, I really love all of these pictures, but this one, when I saw this one, I was really awestruck. I was really struck by the way in which my mother was able, in this one image, she was able to convey the experience of war from the point of view of someone, a child who was observing it. On the one side is this beautiful pastoral image of these two girls, the fruit in the trees, the flowers, the green, the intense green of the image. And on the other side, almost without color, is the brutality and terror of the war. So in this one image, she conveys both the beauty and serenity of life alongside the brutality and terror of the war. It was, as I said, I was awestruck. Next picture, please. So this is now October 1942, and this day was October 15th, 1942. All the Jews of Nishik and the surrounding villages and town were ordered to leave their homes and to report to the train station in Krasnik. My mother refused to go. She begged her father to think of someone, a friend of his, a Polish friend, because he had many friends in the surrounding area, somebody that she and Manya could go to work for. That's how they had survived so far. So she thought if they could get to another village, they could survive in that way. No one knew exactly where the Jews were going to be taken, but having lived under German occupation for 3 years, my mother knew it was not going to be good. Their mother only told them that maybe they would be taken somewhere to be resettled in a ghetto. But my mother knew even ghettos held terror for her. So here, her father finally came up with the name of a friend of his in another village that they could go to, his friend Stefan, in a village called Dombrova. So here they are the next morning with layers of clothing and baskets packed with digging tools, their work tools, and they are saying goodbye to her family, to Esther's family, Esther and Manya's family. And everybody was crying. Now, I want to point out to you that this was one of the earliest pictures that my mother did, because this was one of the most powerful memories that she had the last time that she saw her family. But the next picture is one of the last pictures my mother did of the same scene of leave taking 10 years, but she did this picture 10 years later. And you can see the way in which how much she had learned in the intervening years. She'd learned perspective. The complexity of the picture is so much greater than the earlier picture, which is just on 2 planes. And here, and my mother always said that the earlier picture of the first picture she did of the leave taking was the hardest picture she did, not because it was technically difficult, but just emotionally difficult for her to recall. And yet she went back 10 years later, she went back to another scene of her leave taking. And in this scene, she and Manya are already on their way out of the picture. You can see in the background, she and Manya are walking behind a neighbor that their mother had paid to take them to Stefan's house in Dombrova. And in the foreground are her parents, her mother and father, walking down the hill from their house to one of the wagons that were on their way to the train station. Her brother is standing by the right side wagon. Her younger sisters the two youngest sisters are in the wagon already. And what is so striking to me about this picture is that she was imagining what it was like from her parents' point of view. She was not watching this scene. She was imagining her parents in this scene and what it must have been like for them to have said goodbye to two of their children, probably believing that it was the last time that they would see them, and now making their way with the rest of their family to what they probably saw as certain death. Next picture, please. Well, as it turned out, the neighbor that their mother had paid to take them to Stefan's house abandoned them, probably to turn them into the Germans and get a reward. So my mother took Manya after the neighbor left them at her sister's house and told them to wait there for her. My mother took Manya and they went to the road where all the other Jews were making their way. And they met, right as they got there, they met their cousin Dina. And here, Manya and Esther continued to walk with Dina on the road. And Manya was very happy because she didn't really want to go with Esther in the first place. She wanted to be reunited with the family. And when she saw Dina, she was thrilled to be with family. But as they kept going, Esther realized that they were soon going to be coming to Krashnik, and she just couldn't bear the thought of continuing on the road. And she started to pull Manya off the road to go to turn off to go to Dombrova, to Stefan's house. And Manya didn't want to go. She refused. And it wasn't until Dina, their cousin, told her to go with Manya, to go with Esther rather, that Manya listened. And I have always remarked, I've always noticed that Manya survived because she listened, and Esther survived because she didn't. So next picture, please. I wanted also to point out to you the two girls, the fabric that my mother used for the two girls for their dresses was very purposeful, and she continued to use it. Esther is in the sort of turquoise print dress, and Manya to the right in the darker blue. And she continued to use this fabric in all the pictures that she made of this particular day. So let's go to the next slide, please. Here they are. They've managed to find their way to Dombrova, to the village there, where they'd never been before. And they found Stefan's house, and here you can see the two of them throw themselves into his arms when he opens the door for them, and they explain that they're Hersch's daughters, and they begged him to please take them in. And he did, and he put them up in his attic. You can see them at the top where they're stringing tobacco. And they stayed there for a few days, and then the third day they came down for breakfast, and they saw their baskets packed, and they knew that they were going to leave. And Stefan explained, he said, "My dear children, everybody in Nishik knows that you came to me, And when the Germans come, they'll kill you, they'll kill me, they'll burn down my farm. You can't stay here anymore. So they leave it out into the pouring rain, and they make their way on the muddy road until they come to a forest, and they enter there, and you can see them hanging up their boots to dry. And while they're drying off in the woods, my mother realizes that they can't survive as Hersch's daughters anymore. And so she makes up this story for them that she gives, that they are two Polish Catholic girls who come from another town on the other side of the Vistula River called Chizov, that their family had been displaced from their farm by these so-called Volksdeutsch ethnic Germans, and they had been separated from their parents, and they were looking for work. And my mother made up names for them, very, very Polish names, Maria and Josefina Grochowiecka. And the plan was that they would go to another village and tell people their story and hopes that people would take them in. So before we leave this picture, I just want to point out how remarkable this picture is. My mother wanted to tell of the events of several days, things that took place, what happened over these 3 or 4 days when when they first got to Stefan's house. And she figured out a way to compress all these memories into this one single image. And this is, I think, when I saw this picture, it just convinced me of my mother's incredible artistry. You know, she never thought of herself as an artist, even after she had created all the 36 pictures that she eventually went on to do. She never thought of herself as an artist. She thought she was just documenting what happened to her. And yet we can see just how artistic she was. Next image, please. Well, they went to one village after another, but people there wanted papers. And so they finally came to a village where no one asked them for papers, the village of Grabovka. And people were willing to take them in. And my Aunt Manya found work with with the mother of the sheriff of the village, keeping house for her. And my mother found work with this elderly farmer whose wife was infirm and he needed help with his farm. And he was very kind to my mother and really looked out for her. And here on this another beautiful day in June, this is in 1943, my mother was tending the garden that she had planted when suddenly these 2 German soldiers just trampled into the garden and started trying to engage her. And my mother just kept her, she understood what they were saying. They were speaking to her in German, but she, of course, was not supposed to understand German, which was close to her native Yiddish tongue. So she just kept her head down. And you can see on the left side, her farmer, who she called Dziadek, which is the Polish word for grandfather. He's standing by and watching out for her. And the 2 soldiers were trying to talk to her when suddenly the bees that her farmer kept, you can see the hives in the back there, they suddenly started swarming around the 2 soldiers. And here you see the soldiers waving their hats, trying to get rid of them. But of course, the bees were much more persistent than the soldiers, and finally drove them off, which nobody else could do, only the bees. So my mother used to refer to this as the day that the bees saved her. This picture, how beautiful is this? You know, even though she was recalling a moment of great terror, she included everything that was beautiful around her. The trees that were bearing fruit, the blooming flowers, the strawberries, everything growing in her garden, even the details of the soldier's uniform. Because as I said, she was documenting. So it was important for her to depict everything that was in her memory as closely as she could, even though there were some hard memories. But I think this was actually part of what saved my mother, was her incredible visual memory, that she could be aware of everything that was happening in her environment. And she omitted none of the details of it when she went back to these memories 50 years later. Next picture, please. I wanted to include this because I wanted you to see the detail of the bees. The bees, I think, really knocked me out, how incredibly beautiful they are in their detail. All the markings in their wings, on their body, and every single one of the bees, even in the beehives, is rendered perfectly like this. Next slide, please. Well, after the Russian army, came into the village of Grabovka, they were moving westward, and they liberated the village of Grabovka. And my mother waited for about a month until the fighting died down. And then she went back to her village of Mnishik to see if any of her family had returned. And of course, none had. And when she asked if anyone knew what had happened to them, one of her neighbors said that they really didn't know what had happened to the Jews there, but she thought that maybe they were taken to this concentration camp in the city of Lublin, which was not that far away, called Majdanek. And so my mother went to Majdanek on her own. And you can see her there at the bottom of the picture. This is now in August of 1944, as she's entering the gates of the camp. And you can see that even as she prepares to enter this death camp, she included, because it was summertime, she included around the border of the barbed wire all the flowers that were blooming. And here she enters the camp. This picture really, really compresses the features of the camp. It's a very large camp, and everything is spread out widely. But here my mother wanted to include in the single image those features that really sharply impressed themselves on her. So here she has the gas chambers, the crematorium where the bodies were burned, she includes in the picture on the left, in sort of the middle ground, this building filled with shoes. My mother went through all the shoes that had been taken from prisoners to see if she could find her mother's shoes. And I have to tell you, there are tens of thousands of pairs of shoes that the Germans kept. We went back there to Majdanek with my mother on a family trip in 1999. And we could see all these things spread out over the camp. And when I thought about my mother going through the shoes to look for signs of her mother, it was the most poignant thing I could imagine. And the Russians had liberated the camp. So you can see these officers standing there. Pardon me. They gave her a tour around the camp. They showed her the crematorium and gas chambers, and at the top of the picture, this field of giant cabbages growing on a bed of human ashes. And after my mother saw all of this, she joined the Polish army that was then under Red Army command, and she went with them to Berlin. It was the first time, she was 17 years old then, and it was the first time that she felt she could fight back. All this time she had been in hiding. She couldn't even be herself. And now she could be herself, and she could be part of the victors of this war. Next picture, please. So after they left, after my mother got to Berlin with the army, she left and went back to Poland to get Manya. And then the two of them made their way back to Germany. They went to a displaced persons camp, a DP camp in the American zone. And that's where my mother met my father, who was also a Polish survivor. And my aunt met her husband, likewise a Polish survivor. And they all got married in the camp. Most of the people in the camp were young people, young adults, people whose lives had been interrupted, who had managed to survive the war, whose lives were interrupted by the war, and who now wanted to reclaim their lives and to create new families, to build new families from the ashes of the old. And so they married in the camp, and my father had relatives, some cousins in the United States that he was in contact with, and they found him work. They were ready to sponsor his immigration, but while they were waiting for a visa, my father went to Belgium to find work. My mother was pregnant with me at that time, and he didn't want his child to be born in a DP camp. So he went to Belgium and he sent for my mother, and that's where I was born. And in 1949, again in June, we arrived in New York, where my father's cousin, Clara, who we called Heike, she came to meet us. And here my mother recalled standing and watching as the ship was anchored near the Statue of Liberty. And in the caption to the picture, my mother recalls my father's cousin Clara saying to me, she looked over at me and she said, "My dear child, this will be your America." And there I am sleeping on my father's shoulder. But one of the things that has always struck me about this picture, particularly, I would say, in the last several years, is how welcoming the image of the Statue of Liberty was. This is where my mother said she would never have to hide her identity. She would never have to fear being Jewish. And yet, as welcoming as America was to us, only recently do we see another image of America where people are turned away and locked up. And I think for me, that's a source of great sadness, that the image of America that I always had and the image of the Statue of Liberty that I always had seem to be ignored in recent years. Here, I also wanted to point out how my mother created, this is another aspect of her artistry. The sky is so open. The birds that she includes here are these white seagulls, not the ominous black crows that she included in her earlier pictures. And there is the sense of openness and freedom that she creates with this huge sky that I think is really another kind of aspect of her artistry. Next picture, please. And this is kind of like, I think of this as the coda to her story of her journey of survival. This is now the backyard of our house in Brooklyn. And you can see my sister and me there at the foot of this tree. There is an old overgrown sour cherry tree in the backyard. No one had tended to it for a long time, I guess. But my mother saw this tree and she saw all the possibilities of things that she could cook. Because my mother was not only a very talented artist, she was also a fantastic cook. And so when she saw this tree, when she saw the sour cherries, she saw compotes and pies and blintzes and all the things that she could make. And so she would climb this tree in the summers and she would pass down here these buckets of cherries to me and my sister. And you can see in the background this boy standing looking over the fence. My sister and I were the envy of all the kids in the neighborhood because our mother could climb trees, which no one else around could do. So my mother had kind of a very significant reputation on our block. So in the caption, well, actually, if we could go to the next slide. Here you can see her hidden behind in the leaves on the branches. And in the caption in the picture, she tells of when she was a little girl, she would sit with her grandmother and her grandmother would tell her, "Esther, when you grow up, you're going to go to America because in America, money grows on trees." You know, this was, of course, what so many immigrants thought of, the Golden Medina, the promised land where the streets were paved with gold. And Esther said, when her grandmother would say, "Money grows on trees," she would say, "But grandmother, I'm so good at climbing trees." And every time she would climb this tree, she would remember this conversation with her grandmother. Next slide, please. So this is now the exhibit as it in the current installation at the American Visionary Art Museum. And this is my favorite of all the installations of the artwork. And the artwork, I should mention, has traveled all over the country. And there have even been exhibits in Poland and Canada as well. But this picture, I think, gives you a sense of the scale of the artwork. It's quite large. Much of it is quite large. The first couple of pictures are like 4 feet by 4 feet, more or less. But I love that Rebecca Hofberger, who is the director and curator of this exhibit when it first opened in 2019, actually 4 years ago this month, she had this idea of recreating Esther's house with a cow and a dog and the lace curtains in the window and a thatching on the roof. I was just stunned when she told me about it. And of course, when I got to see it, how beautifully it recreates for this space Esther's world. And I'm only sorry, so sorry that Esther could never see her work exhibited like this, and especially this installation, as I said, with her house pictured. So some of you may know this exhibit of my mother's artwork is part of a larger exhibit called Esther and the Dream of One Loving Human Family. And so I just wanted to show you a few of the pieces. There aren't many, but a few of the other pieces that are part of the exhibit. So if we go to the next slide, please. Two of the paintings in the exhibit were created by an artist named Lily Ye, who went to Rwanda after the genocide there. And she went there to work with villagers in one particular place who wanted to create a memorial. They had never memorialized the people who were lost in their village. And Lily went there to help them create such a memorial, which is quite amazing. And she did these two paintings. This one, there's one of the village before the genocide, when it was still a vibrant, living place. And then this one of the village after the genocide, well, during the genocide, and you can see people fleeing, people dying, people dead. And this is a reminder, if we needed one, of how genocides, the Holocaust was not the first and it was not the last genocide of our times. And it's important, it was important for Rebecca, for the museum in creating this show, and important for us in having the show to connect my mother's Holocaust story with what still is happening in the world today. Next slide, please. This is a painting by an artist named Judy Tallwing, who lives in Baltimore. And she created this painting called Prayer for Peace. In it, I know you can't see it in the slide, very hard to see. She has these very, very tiny beads which each represent a prayer. And I don't know exactly how many there are, but it seems like there are hundreds, if not thousands of beads. And this, of course, connects to her heritage as a Native American and her her beliefs and legends of their mythology and beliefs. And it seemed like a really important piece to juxtapose with these other stories of genocide, that there could be peace and that we need to pray for peace. If you go to the exhibit, you will, those of you who, I know some of you have been, those of you who haven't yet and can get there, you can observe all the beautiful imagery here, including those prayer beads. And the next slide, please. In this image, this gives me a chance to tell you a little bit about Art and Remembrance, the nonprofit organization that my sister and I founded after our mother died, to honor her legacy and to be able to share her artwork with audiences beyond the people who came to our houses to see the artwork hanging there. But in addition to exhibiting the artwork, we also wanted to use my mother's artwork to inspire other people to tell their stories, their own stories of life challenges and family, because my mother's story was really a way to remember her family and to pass her memories on to the family that she created. So we at Art and Remembrance have been doing workshops with school children, and in particular within immigrant communities, and invited people, after they learned about my mother's art and story through seeing her work, to tell their own stories about coming to America and what they experienced in their new homes. And here we did a workshop a few years ago in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And one of the pictures was done by a woman named Ingrid, who told of coming to the United States from her beautiful home in Guatemala, looking for a better life for herself and her children. And here in the middle picture, they arrive in Santa Fe, and it was the first time they saw snow. And it was a wonder for them to be in such a strange and beautiful environment. But in the next pictures on the right, oh, no, I'm sorry, Ingrid, could you go back? I meant in the rightmost panel of this picture. Ingrid recalled that when she applied for work as a teacher, people told her that she would just be taking work from Native people, native to the area, and that she should be working in the fields where people from Central America, she came from Guatemala, where people from Central America belonged. And she was obviously deeply wounded by being turned away, but she was also offended on behalf of the people who did work in the fields, who worked very, very hard in the fields. And although that wasn't what she was suited for, she wanted to honor them. And so she included at the top there a picture of a field worker harvesting vegetables. And in the bottom part of that, she she did eventually find work as a Head Start teacher, and she included her students there. So, and in the corner, top corner on the right, she includes an angel watching over them. And then at the bottom of that picture, she includes the story of these three images. So this has been, I will tell you, an incredibly powerful experience for the people who participate in these workshops to create these story cloths. They are not artists in general. Ingrid, I would say, perhaps has more gifts in stitching than most people do who participate in these workshops, but they all have some powerful story to tell. And for some of them, it's the first time that anyone has ever asked them about their experiences, what it was like for them to come to this country. And yet they have so much to share. So for them, many of them, it's a very cathartic experience to create these story cloths with these brief little narratives to accompany their pictures. And I will say that after we did these workshops in Santa Fe, we had an exhibit. My mother's artwork was hanging there at the community gallery in Santa Fe in the convention center. We have an exhibit of very, very high quality reproductions of my mother's artwork. So we brought that to the community gallery, and alongside the pictures of my mother's artwork, we had this picture of Ingrid's, as well as those of a number of other people who created these story cloths. And afterwards, we invited, of course, the families of the people who created these pictures, but we also invited people who were the non-immigrant part of the community in Santa Fe and we invited them for a conversation, to meet each other, to talk to each other. We had facilitators who were also translating. And it was incredible. And the reactions we heard from people afterwards were that one woman said, "Why have we never done this before?" Another woman who said it was the first time she had ever been in a gallery. It was the first time she'd ever been in that part of the city of Santa Fe. So there's so much to be gained by just simply getting to know one another. And it's creating these pictures was cathartic for many of the participants, and then sharing their stories was as well. And this is part of the mission of Art and Remembrance, and a way of honoring our mother's legacy and her art and her story into the current day. Next picture, please. I wanted to just share with you, some of you may already be familiar with the film that we produced, a 30-minute documentary film, which is on YouTube and which you can access through our website. But our latest project is essentially a video tour of the exhibit, in which I narrate. And so you can see they're all about, the videos are about a minute long, And I talk about every single one of the pictures. So all 36 of them, plus an introduction. So if you go to our website, and I will show you the next slide with our website. Oh, sorry, the next slide is of our book, which you can buy through Amazon. There's a link from our website to it. You can also buy it at the gift shop at AVAM. And then the last slide is our website, and you can find there the video tour, a link to the video tour that I was just telling you about, a link to the 30-minute documentary film, which features my mother, and my sister and I are in it, as well as a couple of expert commentators, and beautiful images of the artwork. So there's a lot of material. We also have lesson plans for educators and students, obviously, that draw on Esther's artwork and to deal with important themes that occur in or are raised in her artwork. So I would leave you with the website address and urge you to go there and find all the other pieces of what we're doing with Esther's artwork to bring her story and her artwork to audiences of children as well as adults. So with that, I will pause. I will thank you so much, all of you, for being here, for joining me in this virtual tour. And I would be so happy to hear your questions.
Yes, thank you so very much, Bernice, for sharing everything. If anyone here does have any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat. Something I'm also going to do is I'm going to post a link to Art and Remembrance in the chat after I am able to pull it up.
Meantime, I'm looking at the chat to see if there are any questions here. Oh, you know, there are several people who I saw that I know. I just want to shout out to Carol Patey in Needham, Massachusetts, a longtime colleague of mine. And I saw Margie Shields and John Shields, sorry, and Margie, who are docents here and longtime docents and longtime docents for leading people on tours of Esther's work. And I so appreciate their dedication and their talents in interpreting this for visitors. Carol Brand. Hello, Carol. How did Esther learn this skill is Carol's question. My mother was apprenticed to a dressmaker when she was 8 years old. So she had a great love of stitching, and as well as a great talent. She would have been a dressmaker had her life continued on the path as she had as a child. She also loved embroidery. And at that time, girls in school learned embroidery in school, and her teacher knew how much she loved stitching. So she would give her patterns to take home, and her mother saved old sheets or whatever she had of fabric so that Esther could practice. So she did this kind of stitching for most of her life. even when she wasn't creating these pictures, she was making things for the house. She was embroidering pillowcases and curtains and knitting and crocheting as well. Her hands were never idle. How long will the exhibit be at AVAM? Well, it will be there for at least another year. And I'm hoping that it will stay on for an additional year, since we lost a year due to COVID and the museum's closing. So, but I would urge you, if you haven't seen it or anyone you know wants to see it, come and visit. Susan says that it looked like some pictures had painted areas, such as clouds. Is that right? Yes. My mother discovered fabric paint along the way, and it helped her realize what she wanted to do. The scenes that she wanted to create. So it worked beautifully for her. Thank you to everyone for your kind comments. I'm glad Denise B says, I've seen the exhibit and have such a greater appreciation of it with your stories. Yes, and this is exactly why we created the video tour, so that you can see each of the pictures. Maybe the narrative is a bit more abbreviated than what I did today, but you can see each of the pictures with my narrative about them. And so I would certainly encourage you to visit the video tour. Oh, very sweet. Carol says, it makes me want to share this in the Boston area. Carol, we can do, as I said, we have this exhibit of very, very high quality reproductions of my mother's work. So even while the original work is here, we can do another exhibit in Boston. So if you want to follow up, please get in touch with me. Carol Brand asks, did my mother teach me and my sister Helene her sewing skills? People often ask me whether I inherited my mother's sewing skills. And I say that my mother's talent was to create these pictures, and mine was to bring them out in the world. I learned how to stitch and I learned how to knit and crochet, but I never had the artistry that my mother had. Thank you to Diane. I appreciate what you say about the work we've done with Art and Remembrance. And as I said, it's all the materials are on our website, and please go visit. Did my mother use a sewing machine to attach applique? Actually, I don't think she did use it to attach applique. I think all of her applique is hand stitched. She did use the sewing machine to create, there are some big areas of landscape, and there's some zigzag stitching. If you look at the pictures closely, you can see, for those of you who know stitching, you can see where she used a sewing machine to create these ribbons, I would say, of pattern. But she did a lot of hand stitching and, of course, the embroidery. But even with the applique, she attached, I think, pretty much all of them by hand. Because, you know, the applique pieces are kind of intricate. Let's see, there's, I think, one last question. How many years? Yeah, good question. How many years did it take for her to do these, all 36 pieces? It's a question I get fairly often. I don't know exactly. Well, it took her roughly 10 years to do all 36. People ask me, how long did it take to do each piece? And obviously, the amount of time it took to do each piece varied. Some were big, some were smaller, some just were harder for her to execute for various reasons. But I figure that she did roughly 36 over, well, 34, because the first two she did were 10 years earlier. So she did roughly 34. She did 34 over roughly a 10-year period. So on average, it took her 3 to 4 months to do a single image. But as I said, it varied by piece. Did I watch her work? My family and I, my kids and my husband and I, would have dinner with my mother, with my parents, every Sunday. And so every Sunday, my mother would show me what she was working on and where she was. I didn't watch her working, but I could see on a pretty frequent and regular basis what she was doing. And I also helped her with the captions. My mother's spelling, you know, you have to remember that my mother's education ended when she was 12 years old, and she never was educated in English either. So her spelling was pretty phonetic, I would say. And if you knew how my mother spoke, then you could read what she wrote. So she needed me to help her with the captions and to write them out, to spell it out for her. And then she would trace it, and then she would transfer it to the caption. So I did play a part in helping her create the pictures, but it was just grammatical, I would say, not artistic. The question is, did she have a studio space? These are large. Amazingly, my mother worked on these either in her lap or on the dining room table. She did not have any dedicated space, she did not have any dedicated space. And she did not use embroidery hoops or anything like that. She just did this kind of freehand. She would she would do the background piece first, and then she would cut out the pieces for the applique, and then she would stitch them on after that. And then she would fill in the embroidery, you know, the embroidery that of the flowers and trees and so on. Her captions, the question is, are her captions embroidered or inked? They're embroidered. Everything, other than the fabric paint, everything is stitched. And did she tell me in advance of her ideas as to how she intended in telling her story through embroidery? Yes, kind of. So I told you I would see her pictures every week when we went up to have dinner with my parents. And when she was finished with one, I would ask her what was going to be next. What was she thinking about? What was the scene that she saw? And she already was, she knew exactly what she was going to, what memory she was going to recreate. But she did, you know, let me just shift subject here. The one picture that I did not know about in advance was a portrait that she did of my father right at, or sometime after he died. And she took, and you can see this online, she took all his old ties and she cut them up and turned them into sort of a patchwork, like a patchwork quilt background. And then she appliqued a portrait of my father as he looked in the passport picture from 1949, when we came to the United States. And she made 3 of these. One she gave to me, and they had very simple captions. They said, "This is my husband, Max Krinitz, as he looked in 1949." And then she had his date of birth and the date of his death. And she gave one picture to me, one picture of these 3 to my sister, and one for my father's sister, who was still living at the time in Jerusalem. And I had no idea that she was going to do this. She never told me she was going to. And by the time I saw her next, she had finished them. And so, of course, she used the sewing machine to create this patchwork background, but everything else was hand stitched. But everything else I knew about. After she did that picture of my father, she decided she was going to do a series of family portraits. And so the next picture that she did was one of my daughter when my daughter was about 3 or 4 years old. And it's a very beautiful picture, but also very moving, because in the caption, she speaks directly to my daughter. So her voice it's in my ear. And then she was going to do her 2 other grandchildren, my son and my sister's son. And she did the pieces, cut out some pieces for the picture of my son, but she never got to finish it. I mean, she got sick in 1999, right after we got back from Poland. And she really couldn't do any more work after that. And then she died in 2001. Were they exhibited when my mother was alive? Kind of, yes. The Washington Hebrew congregation had some people there wanted to exhibit my mother's work, and they didn't really have a separate gallery. So, and we had nothing then. We took them down from the walls of my house. They were not in plexiglass cases, vitrines like they are now. So we had an exhibit at the Washington Hebrew congregation for about a week, but my mother did a program there as well. Just like I did, my mother, I worked the slide projector. We had slides of her, a carousel of her artwork, and she told her story before a congregation. The sanctuary was filled with between 300 and 400 people. And my mother, who had never done any public speaking, my mother held that audience, their attention entirely. You could hear a pin drop while she was speaking. And then, of course, everybody after the program went and looked at her artwork. So that was her opportunity to see how her work was received by people outside of my house, to see a public viewing. And she knew that it was going to continue, but she never got to see it. She never got to see it herself. Have we partnered Art and Remembrance with any other non-art museums, such as the Holocaust Museum? Well, I will tell you a story about the Holocaust Museum. At some point, I realized that I needed to get these works outside of my house. They needed to be seen by people other than those who came to visit me, my friends and my family. But this was not my line of work. I had never done anything in the art world myself. I was in the field of public policy, but I did know how to network. So I started getting in touch with people that I knew in hopes that I could figure out how to get the work out on exhibit. And that's what I was hoping for at the time. And one of the people that I got in touch with was the wife of the then director of the Holocaust Museum. And her daughter shared a cello teacher with my son. That's how I knew her. So she told me that the Holocaust Museum might take the artwork, but they would not exhibit it because they had a policy of not exhibiting post-Holocaust art, work that was done after the Holocaust. I argued, and other people on my behalf argued, that this was a form of survivor testimony, just like the testimony that they were collecting through oral means. But I never managed, and other people, potentially influential people, never managed to dissuade the leadership of the museum from their policy. And so that's it. But we've exhibited the work, as I said, all over the country, and including in Holocaust museums, other Holocaust museums, which are predominantly historical rather than artistic, but who have no such prohibition against or policy against exhibiting post-Holocaust art. So what can I say? I'm just looking to see if there are any other questions that I missed. I think I've covered all the questions, unless somebody has a last minute. We're into the last few minutes of our time, so I don't want to keep you overly long. By the way, if you want to get in touch with me directly, on the first slide, well, you can always reach me through our website, but my email address is just bernice@artandremembrance.org. And I would be happy to hear from any of you that would like to be in touch with me. It's, let me say in closing, it's been a privilege to share all of this with you. Even though my mother didn't get to see it, I feel her spirit in me when I do these programs. So thank you so much for giving me that opportunity.
Yes, Bernice, thank you so very much for all of the wonderful things that you've shared. I know even for myself, I have learned a lot tonight. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this virtual program. Even the questions at the end, I thought were really great questions. I learned a lot even just from that. And just again, thank you so much to everyone, and I hope everyone has a great night.
Thank you all.
Mhm. Thank you.